Let's get started.
Cool. Well, welcome everybody, and hopefully folks will continue to trickle in here. But thanks so much for all of you who are joining live. For folks who may be watching this on demand, we're excited for this conversation. This is a topic that is very hot at the moment, I would say, in the conversations that certainly we're having on the Blink side, day in, day out, with customers and prospects, and when we're out and about, industry events. It's a critical one, and I think as I see leaders, HR people, experience leaders like all of you that are joining us today. I think it's pretty clear at this point that all the data, all the research, the statistics say yes, investing in employee experience has positive downstream implications. Typically, we're seeing that tied to things like overall employee satisfaction, potential reduction in attrition, overall engagement of the workforce. But I think in today's in the current landscape, when we think about the speed at which automation and AI are coming at us all, and the expectations on organizations to start to implement those tools and that business process into the day-to-day operations in order to unlock efficiency, cost savings, return, it is more critical than ever for us to be able to really start to put, brass tacks around, where we're saving money, where we're seeing return, especially under the guise of, investing in employee experience and in employee experience technology. So our hope is that this conversation today is going to have you all leave with some frameworks, some metrics, and even just some questions to start to be able to ask internally within your organization, to start to really firm up, how do you win that budget? How do you have that kind of ROI conversation with the folks that you need to internally, and the other stakeholders that are going to weigh in on the go forward plan for EX? So to help guide this conversation, I am so pleased to be joined by Carrie Higgins Bigelow, CEO and founder of Living HR, who we are proud to partner with here at Blink. Carrie, so great to have you. Thanks for being here.
Thanks, Sloan. It's great to be here. Excited to dive into this one.
Yes, this is a topic we'll be very excited to kind of pick your brain on. Obviously, you've been an operator yourself, Carrie. You and the Living HR team are working with clients, in and around this topic every single day. So I will love for you to maybe a good place for us to start on this conversation, Carrie, is like, let's give a little background to you and how you've fit into these conversations yourself and your operator role, but then also thinking about the work that you all are doing every day at Living HR. Like, how does EX kind of play in that space and in the work that you all are doing?
Yeah, it's everything that we do. I started the company back in 2009 just because I saw that there was this really broken gap between the employee experience that employees were experiencing and the ones that employers were trying to create. And, as we're working with high growth and PE backed and enterprise orgs, a lot of the same things keep showing up, which is that without investment and without the right tools, technology, and intentionality around employee experience, it has an impact on overall business outcomes, your ability to transform. We're all in the mix right now with AI, and all of those things get stalled really if you don't work through your employee experience intentionally. One of the things that I always talk about is how you don't get employee engagement without a great employee experience. One is an input, one's an output. And I think a lot of times with the work that we're doing day to day, we're finding that people are looking for the engagement, but they're not putting the investment in the design of the experience. And so we're really focused on trying to help people be able to get that kind of investment so that they really ultimately can positively impact the business, but also the people, which is a big part of why I started the company. I didn't know why so many people hated work, and I love work. And I wanted to figure out, like, how do we make this good for people because we need them. So
Yeah. Yeah. And maybe a little even about, the composition of Living HR, like how you guys are, set up, the structure, how you work with clients, be helpful kind of context
Yeah,
there as
sure.
well.
It's interesting. We're actually set up, and I saw there's a lot of comms and marketing people on here, and we actually adopted a lot from you all in our structure. We call ourselves the work agency, and we did that very intentionally because we're not consultants, we're not a firm. We're an agency that helps to augment and build and design just like a marketing agency would for marketing, but we do that for people in HR. And so the way we're structured is to support HR and people functions by giving them scale and lift. And we do that in a couple different ways through either managed services, workplace transformation, fractional or interim staff augmentation, and or like leadership and executive search. And so everything we do is built to help people function scale. And one of the things that we kept seeing many years ago is that a lot of the HR solutions that were out there were very cookie cutter, and it was irreverent to employee experience and culture. And that to me is the biggest driver of what the people function can and should be doing alongside, their marketing partners and brand, is that collaboration and using some of that methodology to operate more like an agency versus, traditional HR.
Awesome. Really helpful. And I think, good context for this group to, kind of be aware of in the way that you all are operating. And before we dig into maybe our first meaty topic, Carrie, I do want to just, for the audience, as conversation flows, please pop in questions into the Q&A portion. You'll see on the right-hand side of the platform. Also pop into the chat, which many of you have already successfully done. And we will be weaving in some polls kind of along the way, which again, we've been able to at least see how folks are doing today, but we'll have some other maybe harder hitting questions as we go along. And we'll love your input as we go. And so, Carrie, you've kind of already touched on this in your intro, which I love because I think it is very clearly rooted in the way that you all and your team are thinking about and supporting your clients. But, there is no shortage of priorities, projects, initiatives that, any one organization is undertaking. Even, you rewind 18 months ago, what that looks like, and then times by however many, when you think about, again, that AI and automation layer kind of being added into the mix. So maybe we even start in in its simplest form. When you think about working with clients who are trying to tackle, employee experience, like what does that actually practically mean? And I know, everybody who's joining us today probably has a slightly different view on ultimately how to define that within their organization. But if you were to put kind of a headline against that, and then, maybe the follow-on question to that is like, how does that practically then fit into the mix of all of these other things that are, in play for many organizations day to day?
Yeah, it's funny when I think about the definition of employee experience, I think it's just a culmination of moments. And when you think about all of those different moments where you have to either erode trust, build trust, create connection, create disconnection, whether it's either human and a leader is doing it or a coach is doing it, or it's the technology and the communications that are going out, they either have the impact of making work easier or harder.
Yeah.
And when it's not intentionally designed, you're generally making it harder. And so people have those navigation challenges within their own organizations. One client always comes to mind. We did a map of their employee experience, and every employee had over 76 logins to want to be able to operate and do their job.
Oh, wow.
So there's
a
a
lot.
way to be productive, right? If that's their daily experience. And so simple tool like one login or whatever, you can fix things that you don't even realize are happening, just because things get layered upon layers. And so when I think about all these different groups, they all impact employee experience in different ways. And we are all fighting for a budget to be able to get them to go through, but your budgets are combined when you go together. And I think employee experience is one of those areas where it's not just an HR initiative. It's not just a comms initiative. It's an org initiative. And so, being able to use budget across multiple functions sometimes can help you get the budget through. But, if you think about all these different components and how it shows up, it all fails if you can't communicate it. And it all fails. And every time we go into an organization, the thing we always hear and see is that communication is a problem every time. I mean, I've not gone into one survey output or any focus groups where that has not been true. And so when you think about how to get the budget, it can't just be that you're asking for it to make one change to it, the employee experience, or update one part of it. It's got to be more of a holistic approach so you can actually fund it.
Yeah. If you were to flag for the audience, if you look, even just looking at this landscape, or maybe some factors that live outside of what's represented just on this visual here, what do you think is kind of the biggest, pitfall, or the place where, you've seen customers trip up maybe time and time again? And if you were to kind of guide folks of like, hey, make sure you really zoom in on, on bringing, this initiative along on the ride with EX, or just, preparing accordingly to make sure that, this element of the journey doesn't disrupt your objectives in, unlocking or achieving, optimal employee experience.
Yeah, it's going to sound maybe a little counterintuitive, but organizations that invest in cultural change end up having 5x success rate on things that result in transformation than if you were to not consider how the culture is impacted. Yeah. And so if your culture is not strong enough to withstand all of the change that's coming right now, you've got to first fix that, because people then resist the change. And whatever area that's on this wheel that you're trying to work on or improve, you end up having a failure rate that's much higher, because organizations without those mechanisms for internal comms, whether it's the platform or the right messaging or the right people, are creating a challenge where all of these transformation and change efforts fail, which is a business implication. And so the more we talk about how it impacts the business and EBITDA and margin and revenue and customer satisfaction, the better your likelihood and chance is that you're going to get the investment in the front end, right? Because a lot of this is fixing the front end so that you get the results on the back end.
Yeah, makes good sense. I think is actually kind of a perfect segue as we start to think about, the development of that business plan, the need and necessity to make that as consolidated as possible, but the reality being having one single unified employee experience, budget, business plan, associated metrics can be challenging, and that's kind of inherent in the way that it works, right? Like, it's not any individual who's on this call, it's not a you problem, it's just a conceptual problem. And I think what we see with customers every day is some mix of what's represented in this visual kind of at play here. So I'd love, Carrie, for your opinion on just like, if you boil down kind of where you see, again, maybe the most important persona to be kind of engaging for these conversations as a starting point, or, for our HR and comms folks, like who are going to be like the best, cross-functional stakeholders to bring along on this journey every single time. I guess maybe just some guidance or, what you've seen clients experience and do so successfully, and again, getting arm in arm with the personas that are represented here.
So two things. One is that the employee themselves they're such a great source of data around what is broken and why. Like that example I just shared about 76 logins. When the CEO heard that was the case, we were able to get a lot of investment in fixing those problems, because it became very clear that was a productivity challenge that was impacting the org's performance. That same org had a 200% turnover rate. So you can also appeal to HR, because HR is going, my turnover numbers are
Yeah.
terrible. How is
Yeah.
this happening?
We're
Right?
spending a lot on recruiting and we're not
Right.
seeing that fruit of that labor, right?
Correct. Yeah, you're just burning through people. And
Yeah.
so, one of the things that I think is really important is in order to understand the employee experience, is really doing the work to map the employee experience, use the employee voice to create some of that business case. The other
Yeah.
parts of the business case are here, right? Like your CEO cares about the culture, they care about the bottom line, they care about profitability, EBITDA, revenue. The CFO is probably very similar, minus some of the culture typically.
Yeah.
Um, but if you look at each of these different personas and understand what their primary responsibility is to the org and message things appropriately to their world, you're going to get so much further faster. There's such great data out there now, especially because of AI, where you can very quickly say, we have these positions that we're constantly turning over. We have these challenges with recruitment and we're not filling jobs fast enough and our time to fill is slow. Our client satisfaction scores are going down. You can see all the implications. And if you take those implications and tie it back to how the employee experience is impacted and what you could invest in to create more value for those different audiences, you're going to get a lot further faster than saying like, we just keep hearing that our people are unhappy or,
Yeah. Yeah.
the narratives that get created without data are the ones that don't get approved.
Yeah, it's interesting as you're speaking to Carrie, just and looking at the poll results. It was pretty glaring that the CFO was the persona that folks were finding themselves, challenged with, or maybe looking for guidance on to, how best to navigate or to bring those that persona kind of along on the ride. Obviously, you've already made the point of the importance of being able to tie it to those metrics that obviously a CFO is, maniacal and focusing on, and things like EBITDA being kind of public enemy number one. I guess any other words of wisdom, words of advice in how you've helped clients kind of navigate those CFO waters. Anything that you haven't touched on there.
Yeah, I mean, I think things like productivity improvements and
Yeah.
showing how, making work easier for people decreases the amount of headcount that we need.
Yeah.
Finding ways to create automation shows savings. Figuring out how to appeal to the growth story of what they're trying to accomplish. Most organizations are obviously trying to grow, whether they're in that trajectory or not. But making sure that if you are pitching to a CFO and you're thinking about how to show ROI on a simple investment, let's say it's for Blink, we'll use that as an example. We want to buy Blink, and if you want to get a platform like that, if you said, we're trying to improve employee communication, obviously that's what you're trying to do, but why are you trying to improve it?
Yeah.
What is the impact to the business if you don't do it?
Yeah.
And what is the value you create if you do? And just those two data points will help get to a CFO to realize, okay, it's not this that they want this new cool platform because it looks amazing. It has this great UI UX. It's not because of those factors. It's because it's actually impeding our ability to do work. Our people don't know changes that are coming. They're getting frustrated because information is lagging. They are out in the field and they don't have email and we can't access them. So they're making mistakes that for customers that are making us lose customer investment. Like you've got to give them both the narrative and the data and then tell a story that they understand.
Yeah. Yeah, I want to earmark that the ROI and cost of inaction kind of nuance, and I think I'd love to touch on that as we kind of go to the next section. But you just hit something that I think is super important that I'd love to kind of double click on is that storytelling component and the making sure to create the obviously the metric components being woven in so that there feels like a very practical, again, kind of in the spirit of a concrete business case. But being able to tell a holistic story, and obviously we've got some comms and marketing folks on the call with us today, and obviously outlined here. I guess, how do you underline and bold and italicize the importance of like the storytelling component, and just really how well equipped folks in comms and, collaborating with their, potentially their marketing counterparts who tell stories every single day when, thinking about the customer base that they're approaching. Like, how do you inspire those folks who are coming from that side of the business to, make sure that they understand the value of what they're bringing to kind of this overarching, budget and business case process?
Yeah, there's a couple different things. One is external benchmark data always helps to tell a story, right? Especially if you're using good, credible sources, which if you're doing some research on AI, obviously you want to make sure that the sources you're using are ones that the CFO or CEO would respect and admire and find as valid. And so one is getting the external data to help make that point. The other is using, again, more of the internal data, but visually telling the story with like a dashboard or quotes or things that are direct and irrefutable versus sentiment is definitely going to go further faster. I think that the story is often not the story they've told themselves. Another example I have of that as a CEO said, we're a very family driven company. We care about family. And this is an organization that had 200 employees. And when we went and did the employee experience mapping exercise and immersion, we went and sat in their call centers. We went and applied for their jobs, sat in their onboarding, looked at their scheduling practices, and the employees were calling the way that they worked in terms of schedules, the Hunger Games. And it was because they used to have to bid on schedules. And so this is like a very anecdotal story. But when we brought that up, this is a 200,000 employee organization. We brought that all the way up through the ivory tower and said, you believe that you're caring about family values, but people are leaving because you're cutting their schedules in half and they can't afford to live on a moment's notice. You're not allowing them the opportunity to go to something for their children's school because you're changing schedules in a moment and it's managed out of the Philippines and nobody knows how these calendars are working. And so just that data point and there were multiple because of this employee experience being so broken, made them completely reimagine their entire org, like the way they structured it, the platforms they invested in, and it was because it was a very clear story. There was the data, there was the narrative, there was the visualization of the story, and it was irrefutable. He brought it to the board, publicly traded company, the board, everybody was approving all kinds of money to fix this, right? So you couldn't fix it fast enough. And so what I encourage people to do is just make sure that you've got all the components of the story and know where people are going to push back before you go in and tell it. So test it with some of these other stakeholder groups and say, what is broken about my story? What would you push on? And before you go in and ask for the money.
Yeah. And to your earlier point in the conversation on the organizations who have successfully navigated projects like this, having a really sound, cultural baseline that they're staying true to, makes this all the more important, because then if there's just some continuity in the way that the business kind of perceives themselves and how you're aligning to help in reinforcing those, cultural pillars and standards, the easier and kind of, again, more consistent that story becomes. Exactly. So I want to, kind of pivot to this. Obviously Living HR has, really put a lot of thought in and done a lot of work in this kind of budget building exercise, in collaboration with many of your, the clients that you're working with day in, day out. And I want to, again, in that kind of COI, ROI conversation, kind of dig in a little bit on some of these, what is this formula or kind of matrix of, kind of data points and measurement? Like, what does that really look like? I'd love to, maybe you can start just kind of by breaking down how you all thought about this as kind of an overall framework, and maybe even highlight some, elements of this, again, formula sheet, that you feel like are, maybe hardest or most critical for organizations to really, get right or spend the time to get right.
Yeah, the revenue per employee is one that always resonates with PE and CEO. The thing that I would say about all these metrics is the more you take the data point and then tie it to the thing that that stakeholder cares about. So again, if you use the example of, let's see, time to fill, instead of talking about solely time to fill, again, there's a story to tell. It took us a long time to fill this position because our candidate experience is broken. We're not getting the word out in all the right channels. The cost of that role not being filled within our organization cost us X number of dollars because we weren't able to produce revenue because this was a sales role. So we lost X number of dollars in revenue because our time to fill lagged. And that makes sense to the business. Just talking about like, oh, it took us a long time to fill. They'll be like, fix your processes. Why? I mean, go faster, you know? And so you really have to be able to correlate these different numbers, no matter what the number is, whether you're looking at like employee net promoter score is one that I actually use all the time, whatever that's, if it's your engagement score, and connect that to your client net promoter score. As your employee net promoter score goes up, your client net promoter score goes up. People understand that your client net promoter score leads to customer retention. That retention then yields to dollars. And so, again, every time you've got a data point, take it back one step further and tell the story with the data point that's on this slide and attribute it to something as close as you can to the customer EBITDA, profit, or revenue.
Yeah. And I think, part of, the challenge, and opportunity, I think jointly here is that, many of these, if you're, breaking down your, this formula sheet, kind of the practicality of like what the current state is, and what the potential could be, that does not live within one part of the organization. Like we'll have conversations with, maybe HR or comms folks kind of just on a, and maybe better examples like comms folks who may not be as intimately aware of some of these implications, and, again, where the business is currently performing at. How would you, maybe for those comms folks or for folks from HR who are maybe sitting within a certain subset of the organization and may not be aware of kind of like the broader scope, like not CHRO purview, how do you go about kind of like having that conversation internally to start to kind of unlock some of this data? Like any, again, kind of words of advice or process that you've seen work really well with clients to, if you sit down and trying to kind of map to this data, like how do you even start to unpack that?
Yeah, I think especially I'll focus on the comms side for a second. Every decision or change or update to a process or strategic initiative or cultural goal that you have is predicated by comms working, right, and reaching people. And so a lot of times comms is the very first line of defense to creating any of the positive numbers that anyone wants to see that are up on this deck. And so if the open rates and adoption and activity and engagement on the platforms demonstrate that people are receiving these messages and do understand and are validating the information, then you can start to prove the case of how, it's working, that we're positively impacting employee net promoter score because our people are able to have the information they need when they need it. It's easy to get to. They're not having to go to 20 different platforms to try to figure out what's going on within the organization. And one of the other things that it sounds, somewhat counterintuitive is that a lot of times what employees are asking for when it relates to communications is not org-wide announcements. It's what's happening to me in my job, in my role? Are
Right.
you changing the machinery that I'm using? Why? Are you changing shifts? Why? And so the benefit of having a platform like this and or using data that's relevant to departments even more granularly is very helpful in getting organizations to understand what to communicate, how to communicate it, and then how that ties back to employee net promoter score or how that's impacting turnover or why we're our internal mobility rate, which means
Mm.
how much people are moving up within the organization, is either working or not. Like, are we getting them the information they need to build skills? And so comms has this really great opportunity to almost take credit
Yeah.
for all of the efforts, any effort that goes out within the organization. If it was a success, it's because we communicated right. And I
Yeah.
think a lot of times comms teams don't necessarily celebrate or pull that story through after the fact. So I guess what I'm
Yeah.
encouraging is a little bit of, I hate the term postmortem, like I always call it
Mhm.
reflection, is when you launch an
It's a
initiative,
lot more positive a light when you say reflection versus
it
postmortem.
is. It's a lot better to go back and tell that story to executives so they
Yeah.
see, okay, that's why we need to keep doing this. That's why we need to invest because it resulted in X. And a lot of times those stories never get told.
Yeah, yeah, and I think that internal mobility one is such an interesting one that we've seen often kind of get left out. But even when you start to look at the research of what frontline employees especially are looking for, is that
Hmm.
we just want some visibility into what else, what other opportunities. Yes, within my current role, like from a shifts and overtime perspective, what else I could be doing to earn more. But what additional skills can I develop? What other opportunities? Maybe it's within a different plant or a different retail location. Could I, have the opportunity to, participate in? And that level of personalization often gets left, kind of by the wayside, and the implications and what we've seen kind of benefit organizations and getting really specific in what you show an individual as an opportunity to stay, use, apply all that they've learned over their, tenure and engagement within the organization to another, maybe more impactful role. It's just something we can't kind of underline enough as a huge unlock in these circumstances. And so maybe that unlock is a good cue of with thinking about, again, we've alluded to it, but I'd love to unpack it more, this cost of inaction versus return on investment and the difference between those two things.
Hmm.
How do you guide folks to kind of balance both of those, kind of categories of metrics or, positioning within a business case for budget? Like, how do you equate for both of those things when, guiding a client?
Yeah, I think it is both. I
Yeah.
don't think you can get the outcome that you're looking for without telling both stories. And so unless I guess the story you're telling is that we already acted and the result was very positive.
Yeah. Yeah.
But
Yeah.
otherwise, I think if there's a narrative around not doing something and what the implication would be to the business. So an example might be that we want to invest in a new learning program or training content, or we want to do a push around everybody doing this AI course. And if you show that if we don't get adoption for AI within our organization and we're not creating that kind of value within the organization, our efforts from a transformation perspective will fail.
Yeah.
And we don't invest in these things from a culture standpoint, we will not be able to achieve this massive effort that is critical to the business success. Those kinds of things, you have to sound the alarm, right? And
Yeah.
I'm not one that generally believes in, fear people into action. That is not my style at all.
Yeah.
But from an inaction perspective, you're only harming the business by not making it really clear what it will do. And you're also harming the employees, right? Because that's something that they need that they will not get. And
Yeah.
that creates that frustration. On the value creation side and showing ROI and telling an organization and sharing up why the organization's ROI will be impacted, I think you have to balance that with reality. I think a lot of people, and the data sometimes shows something that, we're going to get 4x revenue. Like, nah, you're probably not.
We don't need to be that aspirational in this conversation.
Be realistic in the data that you present and show incremental change, right? You're not going to be able to massively disrupt an organization. And even though the benchmark data says, yes, like we're going to get 4x if we invest in employee experience. Yes, that's true for those that have been investing in it for years and have done a phenomenal job building a structure that really works. What you can show is a win that moves towards those increments. And so being very reasonable, because what can happen is you make big promises and they don't deliver, and that reflects very poorly on everyone, right? And so I've seen a lot of people misstep there where they make it sound like this business case is going to change the world. We're going to make X millions more. And, they would be just as good, knowing they made $1 million more. And then the next year made another $1 million. Like that kind of incremental change is much more consumable for executives and doesn't put, other people in a bad spot when it doesn't come to fruition if you overstate the potential.
And it underlines your point earlier of like, it's critical to have both that COI and ROI blend into the mix here, because that if we don't do anything, here are the cost implications of that for the business. And so just by solving for it, and even if we don't necessarily get a return, you've kind of returned back to a baseline. And then to your point, not being afraid of 1, 2, 3% kind of incremental, return metrics or, opportunities for efficiency, while those numbers may, not necessarily, get people to drop to the floor of, oh my God, we have to give this budget right away, right now. If you start to really do the math in many of those cases, those little increments can make a massive difference, and even just, provide justification of whatever business process change you're going to do or what technology you may put into the mix. And that may be enough to kind of get you over the hump. It doesn't necessarily have to be, to your point, we're going to 4x revenue in like the first 6 months. It's the golden rule of, under promise and over deliver can sometimes work to your benefit here. Awesome. So I want to transition to kind of helping folks kind of anticipate. So you've gone through the process, you've built your story, you've aligned to kind of the imperative that may be kind of relevant within your organization, of which an EX investment makes the most sense. You've started to prepare kind of, the math of it all, and start to, follow some of the framework of what we've just talked about, and balancing COI and ROI, and how ultimately that aligns to and helps in justification of budget. The inevitability, you start to shop that around, you go to kind of the personas that we've identified earlier in the conversation. There's inevitably going to be some pushback along the way. So how do you start to kind of, again, anticipate some of these, what we've categorized as these maybe 4 most logical categories of pushback? Maybe we can talk through each of them, but, I'd love for you to maybe highlight again, like the most common that you've seen amongst customers that they can, are in the clients that you're working with, and how to kind of prepare accordingly.
Yeah, I think a lot of times I see pushback because of, and it's one of the choices in the poll is, there's other priority. Yep. Oh, everybody's picking it.
100% here.
Yeah, that, there's other things we need to invest in, and there's and so finding out what those other things are and how this impacts that other thing is really important. And a lot of times, again, it's not a single threaded exercise to improve employee experience. It impacts every single other initiative that you are doing, just like communications. So tying it ahead of time, ideally to what is important to the priority of the business, and or thinking about the strategy of the business. If you don't have a strategy or OKRs that create clarity within your organization, you really need to find out, like, what is the CEO focused on? What are we really trying to get done? And when you know that, you can tie your story to it. And so I think one of the other challenges that I see when it's a different priority that comes up or something becomes more important, it's not necessarily a no, it just might be a not right now. And so how do we then time it and ask for approval for a later launch, right? Rather
Yeah.
than just accepting the no and saying, okay, well, I'm done. They said no. It's saying, well, how else can I show you that this is important? I
Yeah.
want to go back and get some more data for you. And then I'd love to create a timeline of when this might be something that we would be willing to invest in, and don't just walk away. And I think a
Mm.
lot of times people take a no too quickly. And, I think, in sales, they tell you that it's three no's before you get a yes. So
Yeah.
if it's really business critical and you genuinely believe that this is important, keep building the business case and don't just take a no on its surface and let it go. Really keep going. I think the other side is, if they have these pushbacks, there's something in the story we didn't tell, right? So we need to go back and look at what are the data points we provided, where do they have concerns. Then it turns into more of a stakeholder conversation rather than just accepting the no, and keep asking questions about where their apprehension is. Keep
Yeah.
on digging in to figure out, is it that we really legitimately don't have the cash, which is a
Yeah.
different problem than we just want to use the cash somewhere else.
Do something else.
Right. So I think you've really got to challenge, which is uncomfortable. People don't like doing that.
Yeah.
But it's, especially when you're working with executive teams, they're used to it. It's fine. It really is, as long as you're doing it with data and with, common human respect and dignity and all of
Yeah.
those other things.
Yeah.
You're not, trying to challenge aggressively, of course, but, I think that what's most important is making sure you understand the hole that you need to fill in the story that you've created, because there usually
Yeah.
is one, and don't
Yeah.
give up.
Yeah. Yeah. I think, the first no is almost, it's almost a given.
It's
It
obligatory.
is
Yeah.
very rare for these circumstances to, you to get the green light on the first go. So I think, that persistence, and refinement is, obviously, helpful guidance. And I think, probably the most common challenge, and from what the poll data has indicated, it's that not now, or there's just inherently other priorities that are taking up more space. So continuing to map to what those said priorities are and how this ultimately can aid that is sage advice. Maybe touching on quickly, we didn't talk about the risk or the like profiles of risk. I think what we hear oftentimes, again, especially with our focus and a lot of the work that we do with frontline organizations, it's like this scary feeling of giving the keys to folks who haven't had it before, and like, what does that potentially kind of crop up from maybe new information, or kind of new engagement, or almost people's minds start to go to, if we give them a platform, we're going to unlock like all of this messiness that we don't necessarily want to kind of bring to the surface. Is what other, that's one version of risk, right? And like the social media element of it all. Is
Mm-hmm.
any other risks that, again, in helping our folks kind of anticipate what will come up? Obviously there's going to be IT risks and the security elements of it all. Any other kind of, preparation folks can do to kind of mitigate some of those risk pushbacks?
I think one that comes up a lot is adoption. Like, what if it's not used? And what if it's rolled out a bunch of other things that haven't worked? Why is this going to work? And what are you going to do to make sure that it works? And so, I think figuring out and showing a really intentional plan of how you're going to drive adoption and make sure that it's having the impact and what you will report back on to prove that it is, alleviates a lot of concern. If if you can say up front that I'm going to report back to the executive team monthly on these key metrics around the utilization of this platform and what we're seeing and experiencing. And these are the features that we can start small and we can add these features in. We don't need to go, again, using more of an iterative process on how you build something is a lot less scary for implementing big change. And so, starting with something that is the minimum viable product, essentially, that, the employees can use, and then you continue to add and expand, and don't shock them out of the gate. I think a lot of times people tend to see all the amazing bells and whistles of something that you could use, and you can use all of them and you should use the majority of them over time. But I think a lot of times people try to unlock too much too fast, and that creates fear and that risk conversation.
Yeah. And that's actually a perfect segue. We did have a question about, getting employees bought in is one of the hardest parts. So like to your adoption point, how can I pull them into this dialogue in a way that still feels authentic? As, you made the point earlier on of like when looking at that persona map, is the employee base and the folks quite literally on the front line every day are such an important kind of critical, information source of the how and the why and the what. How do you think about in the spirit of ensuring there's a reduced risk from, making sure the system and the process are adopted and used consistently? How do you think about kind of bringing those, again, frontline employees using it every day along on that journey?
Yeah, this sounds very simple, but I really believe wholeheartedly you've got to talk to them directly and gather feedback from them. And focus groups and, interview AI chats are becoming very popular, and really finding out what's important to them. And then the whole what's in it for me, kind of old cliche is just very true. And so if it's not going to make their job easier, they're not going to be invested in it. And if you understand what their pain points are, they're going to be much more willing to come into the conversation. I also think immersion is a very powerful thing. Like you are an employee of your own organization. And so really thinking about the things that get in your way and challenge you, or messages that, as an example, come from HR that feel very legalese or compliance driven and not very human centered. One of the things that we talk a lot about at Living HR is understanding, how do you communicate to a human? They don't need corporate jargon, right? Like people are done with that.
Plain English. Yes.
They need, plain language that makes it clear. What are you asking me to do? What do you want from me? And so, I think really being human centered in the way that we communicate to them also lets them build trust back, because a lot of times when they're apprehensive, there's might be a bigger trust issue with why they're not willing to come along, or they're fearful of something that, are you going to implement AI and that's going to take my job, is obviously the big story of the day. And so are we using AI as an enabler, or are we using AI as a cost savings measure? And organizations have to be really careful with those kinds of messages in order to get the employees to want to be a part of these solutions. And what I keep seeing organizations misstep in trying to bring employees along is that, they launch a survey, which is great. That's one data point, but it doesn't tell you within the day-to-day what they're actually experiencing. And so
it's a point in time. Yeah.
It is. Yeah. It's a moment in time. And so you have to talk to people. You really have to, whether it's a focus group, whether it's interviews one-on-one, like really try to understand, and then get, champions and ambassadors and people that are out in the field as part of the program, create incentives, make it fun, don't make it another thing that you have to do, make it something that you get, right? It's a win.
Yeah. I think you'll hear myself and one of my colleagues going to consistently say this, like, don't forget the fun factor. It is such an important part of all this. I mean, that's kind of the beauty of it being a project and an initiative that's about enabling humans. Like, at our core, like, you said your inspiration for Living HR was like, how do I make people actually enjoy their work every single day? Like, how do I make that just, a better experience generally? And I think, not forgetting to, like, have a little levity, a little bit of fun, and it never hurt no one. So,
It did not. Our chief
yeah,
creative officer gave this one wonderful gift to our organization, which is a channel in our internal comms platform called Keep It Light. And
yeah,
it's literally just levity. It's people post whatever that's funny,
yeah,
that's, and
yeah,
it creates such positive energy, and people want that. People don't
yeah,
want to feel the drag of the corporate jargon or the corporate mindset, or the stress. I mean, there's so much happening to our employees. The change is like 7x what it used to be.
yeah.
It's very hard now with work and life to integrate both. And so we really have to be very human centered in the way that we're approaching it.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think a great note to kind of button this all up is like maintaining humans at the center of these initiatives and these projects. I do want to highlight for our folks who are joining, part of, resources that'll be available to you just to kind of continue the conversation and hopefully aid some of the kind of internal process you may be navigating and in your current state. That's sheet that we, the kind of formula sheet that we referenced that Carrie walked us through that Living HR created is in this guide. So use this QR code to go and take a deeper look at that white paper. And then also, as we've mentioned, kind of again, that balancing act of ROI, COI. On Blink's website, we do have a cost of doing nothing calculator. So a nice opportunity to start to kind of play with those numbers, based upon the current state and your current performance in your organization. So with that, thank you so much for having us. I guess, Carrie, any parting words of wisdom that you leave to the audience? Anything that you'd share with folks, just as kind of a last tidbit as they embark on this kind of budget unlock journey?
I think the last parting piece would just be to make sure that you really do tell the story, and use the voice of your people to make sure that you are giving them what they need to make their work easier, and I think when you're up against a budget conversation, what you always have to remember is the people on the other side of it, and whether it goes through or not, what the implications of it are. And I hope that more and more organizations, continue to be people first and human centered in their work and what they do. And, comms is a huge part of that. Again, it's always the thing that comes up in surveys, using the platform to your advantage. You've got these amazing tools like Blink out there that make employee experience so much easier. And so the more we fight for these investments, the better the outcomes really are.
Awesome. Well, Carrie, thank you so much for sharing your experience, the work that you all are doing. If folks obviously are interested in chatting more with Carrie, please, best probably to connect on LinkedIn. But again, Carrie, thanks for your time. Attendees, thank you for being here. And hopefully this is not the end of this conversation. We'll continue it along. So appreciate you being here.
Thanks so much, Sloan. Thanks, everyone.
Awesome. Take care, everybody.